Excellent. Right, the only thing standing between you guys now and prizes and the final part of the conference is me talking about security. So I know that Michelle said that the graveyard shift was just after food, but this really is the graveyard shift. So I'll try and keep this as light as possible. And there's lots of complexity within the Microsoft 365 environment around security, about how you keep your data safe. So I'm just trying to do it from a user's point of view, but we will dip into a little bit of tech as we go along. So let me get this clicker to work. I'll wander over here and do it. It's not happening. Bear with. Go back to the old way. So security in the pre-cloud environment. So before all our information sat in the cloud, back in the old days when I first started working in IT 20 odd years ago, our computer was in a room physically in our organization, and the security mainly consisted of me locking the door before I left it in the evening to make sure no one could get in there. Yes, we had some terminals around the factory that I worked in, but they were always locked away, so no one could get anywhere near that information in the old days. Then the internet came along, and we had to put a connection into the internet, and we protected ourselves from people getting in that way using a firewall and using logon security. So there were people, no one could actually get in unless they came through that firewall, and I could therefore protect all my information. And if the worst came to the worst, I could just unplug it, and I could take away any capability for anyone to be able to actually electrically access my organization's information. Then email came along, and I've suddenly got a bit of a risk in that people could send emails with files attached to them. They could potentially be sending stuff to people that I didn't want them to get that information. And therefore, we started to put perimeter solutions in for scanning of emails to make sure that information that shouldn't go outside the organization wouldn't be able to go outside the organization, and that people couldn't get into the organization as well. So those kind of things like data loss, leak protection, about email scanning, so I was making sure that people weren't emailing stuff out, were just perimeter solutions. And alongside those was I would stop my employees from looking on the internet at things that I didn't want them to look on the internet. Let me just try and work out the best way to do this. Then the cloud came along and things changed. And it was no longer our office I was trying to protect. I could no longer lock the door because all my employees wanted to access that information remotely anyway. So you get into scenarios, as you can see on the slide here, people would be sat on a train accessing that information. They'd generally be coming in through a virtual private network to get to my environment. But more and more information went into the cloud, went into shared computers in data centers all over the world. So we need a new way of protecting this type of information. And Microsoft 365 provides the kind of functionality that we need to do that. So all of a sudden, a lot of my applications are online. So I don't know if we use kind of web-based solutions for HR management. Some people have got their accounting systems in the cloud. All of that information to do with our organization is now not held in a room that can be locked and a cable that can be unplugged. It's all over the place. We now communicate in different ways. So if I'm using Microsoft Exchange Online and I send an email from me to one of my colleagues, it goes nowhere near my office. So any device that I've got sat in my office to scan and see what I'm doing within that email and whether I'm sending an inappropriate file to one of my colleagues or information about the organization out to one of my friends, that email transaction doesn't actually go through my office at all. So we actually need a different way to protect things. So one of the other challenges with Microsoft 365 is that we can store things in all kinds of places. It's not just our departmental file share on a server that's sat in our organization. I can be saving things to OneDrive. I can be saving things to a Files tab within Teams. I could be sharing something via and saving it to a SharePoint database. I could be publishing it on our intranet, or I could be putting it up on Viva Engage. And those things are not within our organization. Those are all held within Microsoft's cloud. And that leads to kind of a problem that was mentioned earlier, then that many people don't know where those things are stored. If I can't find it in PowerPoint's latest files, then I have to think, oh, did I save it to my OneDrive? Did I save it to my departmental share? Did I save it to my departmental SharePoint site? And that leads to a kind of reduced productivity. It creates security issues. Any complexity in knowing where things are stored adds a layer of complexity to our security. And that's what hackers like. Hackers like confusion because they can find ways through that. And with our employees saving things to places they don't really understand can lead to chaos. So one of the places you need to start with managing and planning security is to have an agreed set of storage rules within your organization. Just as many organizations we work with have a communications charter which says we'll use email for this functionality, we'll use chat for this function, we'll publish it on the internet for this kind of communication. When we have a communications charter for that, we also need rules around storage. Where are we going to store things? So OneDrive, what should we use that for? Everyone who has a Microsoft 365 environment can have OneDrive enabled. What do we store in OneDrive? Because I could be working on something and decide to share that with someone else in the organization. I can do that from my OneDrive. Or if it's a shared file, should it really be in my departmental team? Or should it be somewhere else within that environment? We need to set a set of rules. Often think of this as like if you had a rugby match without any rules on of engagement, no offside rule, no rules about what's in and out of play, then it would be absolute chaos. It would be like a bun fight. And we need to set some rules to where people are going to store things. And think very carefully about OneDrive, how we're going to use that in our organization. We get some very limited controls about how we can set OneDrive up, how we can set it up to share things, or what people can store in that. And the important thing about any kind of charter like this is that we need to communicate it to our staff. So it's important to get it set up to start with and get it documented to start with before we start lots of training with staff. So it's important to train people to say, when you're working on a file, and often for OneDrive, it will be files that are like work in progress, just things I'm working on myself, should be saved there. As soon as I'm collaborating with other people, I want my whole department to be able to see it. I need to be able to share it with my, through a departmental or a project-based team. This is just doing a different thing every time I press the button. Okay, so one of the first things we have to think about when we think about security is actually our individual identities and who we are. Because if I can get into a site impersonating someone else, then I can get access to all of the files that they're responsible for and they've got permissions to see. So it's quite important to get that front door to our organization sorted, because the front door isn't walking into our head office anymore. That's not what's giving us access to the data. The front door is really the internet. And the first thing we hit when we come into on our laptop from the train as being the front door of our organization is where we sign in and say who we are to the organization. That's the only way in which it knows it's Anthony Charman and can decide whether I'm allowed to have access to what information I'm allowed to have access to. So our primary focus, and the first thing we should be thinking about, is our identity in an organization. So phishing, hacking, phishing attacks and things like that, you'll all be familiar with that. 66% of organizations in the UK experienced a phishing attack in 2021, even higher in the USA. And this is people phishing to try and get your identity. So they're trying to get your username and your password, and therefore they can get into the organization. There's a website called, which many of you will know, which is I'veBeenPawned.com, which I went on the other day and just put my username in, and I found that my name had been breached in 7 different occasions. One of them to Adobe having a hack some time ago, one through LinkedIn, and another one through MyFitnessPal. So my information, my username and password has been leaked and have been leaked out to the internet, and it's probably available on the dark web for people to get hold of my information. And if I was still using that username and hadn't changed my password recently, they could come into my organisation, they could come into Computer World, and Computer World, as far as it would know, would see that person as being me and give access to all of the files I have access to. There's also things like social engineering. You see these things on Facebook which says, can you tell, what was your mother's maiden name? Was it funny? And you get lots of people asking for things like that. And I see so many people naively respond to them. What's the name of your first dog? So a lot of these challenge response questions that are asked as part of your security profile are often being gathered on social media. So we need to have strong password policies as an organisation. We also need to train our users in how to identify these things. Yet again, it's doing something different. So two-factor authentication is becoming mandatory, or multi-factor authentication is becoming mandatory, and many of you will be used to this, and many of you will have policies in place to make it work. So often within Computer World, if I'm physically in the office, it won't ask me to authenticate. However, if I'm outside of the office and I try and log in, my phone will buzz and I have to sign, to log into the phone and say, yes, I'd like to, it is me trying to enter the organisation. People are becoming a bit kind of over used to that and are just authenticating without thinking. So Microsoft have just introduced the fact we'll have to do number matching when we implement multi-factor authentication. So it will send us maybe a 2-digit number that we have to type in to actually confirm that it's us. And so that will be something that rolls out within the next couple of months. And that would just make sure it significantly reduces the opportunity for someone who's not you actually getting into your organisation, although there have been some breachings around that. I'm now going to look at, the problem with this is once someone's got into your organisation, how do you actually protect the information that you've got? And I'm going to look very quickly at 3 simple solutions. I'm going to do them very simply, but they're quite complex to set up in the background. So it's don't think that they're as easy as the ones I'm showing. So data loss prevention is about how do we stop people sending information to people that they shouldn't have. And as I said, in the old days it was fine with email because we could just monitor all the email. Now we've got so many different ways of sending stuff that we need to be able to monitor them and implement systems to actually look at what we're sending to people. So we can set up data loss prevention in Microsoft 365 to look for various things. We can look for personal identified information. We can look for credit card numbers, and we can look for various other things like driving license numbers. There's over 100 different categories that we can build there. We can also build custom word lists. So if we don't want our salespeople talking to other people about our brand new product names, we could be putting those in there and saying, don't let this word go outside of my organisation. And it looks a little bit like this when we do it. This is on a chat message. You can see I've tried to send my credit card number to someone, and this is a chat message, not an email, and it will just come up and say, this message is blocked because it's identified some sensitive information within that message. So that's how it comes up. It says a little message saying, what can I do? You can hit that and it will say why it's been blocked. If it's configured in the way that says it allows you to override it on this occasion, you can override it, but that will be logged in the audit logs that sit behind the Microsoft 365 environment. So you can see someone has consciously shared that information. That will work in chat messages, work in Teams messages. It works across email as well. So we've got that capability across all the different ways in which we can communicate information. The next one we're going to look at is Purview Information Protection. So this used to be called Azure Information Protection, and this is the ability for us to start categorizing information and messages within our organization to make sure that only the right people can get hold of them. So if things are categorized, you can see along the top there, the ability to categorize any kind of document or message. If they're categorized as something like proprietary internal only, we can put rules in place that make sure that that document is never sent outside the organization, be it on a chat message, be it on a Teams message to an external participant. And we can also enable that to mean that it's blocked before it goes out, or if it can be allowed to send out, we've got the ability to withdraw access to that document because it's been encrypted before it's gone through the door. And yet again, that hits the centralized auditing, so we can see if people have overridden that category. We can prioritize these categories and say, look, no one can reduce the level of sensitivity of a document or an email without actually them putting a justification in for that and that being recorded in the audit logs. So we can also force with that, we put a compulsory headers and footers on there. We can say it's an internal only document, so it's not allowed outside the organization. We can force that encryption. We can say it can't be forwarded. So I could send an email to someone outside of my organization and say they can't forward it on to someone else in a third-party organization. And we can also say we're going to block the download of it so people can see the attachment and view it, but can't actually save it down and to their file store. And we can also stop people copying and printing. And it also works in file share. So if I'm sharing a file in a Teams meeting, it will just show that as a black block if I put it onto the screen. So you can't actually use it in file sharing in Teams. And the next one, which is one that is very, slightly off to the side, is data retention. We've got incredible data retention functionality within Teams. One of the things we spend a lot of time is talking to people who've got a massive on-premises data store. They need to move that across into Microsoft Online to make those files usable within Teams. And yet they've built up years and years of data. Some organisations, I don't think they've, most organisations I deal with don't seem to have deleted anything other than by mistake for the last 25 years. So, they're getting a vast amount of information there. They've never thought about the consequences of that. They're backing that data up on a regular basis, so they're probably paying money to store that in a cloud somewhere. And they probably, most people I talk to, probably 80% of the information hasn't changed for some time. And they really shouldn't be backing it up. And there's also consequences from a GDPR point of view of holding that information. And you need to start thinking about getting rid of it. One of the things that we do when we do a Teams kind of file migration, and we take from on-premises SharePoint or on-premises file share into Teams, is encourage people to do a data hygiene exercise before they move it. Otherwise, you're just moving all the rubbish and causing more trouble. But there's some great data retention policies available in Microsoft Teams. So you can say, look, after a certain amount of time, just delete these files. Or after, these files cannot be deleted until a certain time. So it means it's enforcing you to retain them. And it's a great way just to start looking at your data and trying to reduce the amount of data that you're carrying with you. So all of this comes together into our data protection strategy, and I've just put the Microsoft generic diagram there about there, just the importance of knowing your data, protecting your data, protecting data loss, and then starting to govern your data and put the right compliance mechanisms in place to ensure your data is safe. So that's all I've got to say. It's quite a big topic, and we've covered it very, very quickly. But I hope that makes sense and gave you some idea of the potential that's there. If you're in the IT department or you're a user in an organisation, then just talk to your IT department about if they don't have multi-factor authentication in place, then make sure that they're putting in place, because it's the easiest way for people to get into your data. And then start to think about some of the other pieces as well. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. I think we've had some really, really good sessions. I thought Michelle was great. You can see why he's paid lots of money by Microsoft to talk about these things, because he put it across really, really well. And thanks to Megan going through that. I hope you found this good. This was a new kind of idea, a new innovation for us to do a people-focused stage as well as a technology-focused stage.